My name is Sherilyn Payne. I'm an attorney with the Fenton and Keller Law Firm, and we are attorneys for Employnet. I'm talking to you today about preventing harassment and discrimination in the workplace, and also about reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities. Throughout this presentation, there will be quizzes, and what I'm going to do is read you a scenario, give you several choices, give you a few seconds to think about the responses, and then I'll tell you the response. So here we're starting out with a hypothetical. When you're at home, you're just relaxing, you're watching TV, you hear the ding from your cell phone so that you know that you have a text. You go check it, and it's a text from a coworker. It's a coworker saying that he or she thinks you're very attractive. There's some really suggestive remarks. You feel very uncomfortable. You are going to have to go back to work and encounter this person, and that makes you feel uneasy. So what do you do? Do you treat the matter as something private that happened outside of work? B, do you report the incident to your client's supervisor? C, do you report the incident to the Employnet Human Resources Director or an Employnet representative? Or D, both responses B and C, report the incident to your client's supervisor and or to the Employnet HR Director or an Employnet representative. What do you think? So the answer is D, either response B and or C. You report the incident to your client's supervisor, the Employnet Human Resources Director, or an Employnet representative, or you can report it to all of the above. And here we have another hypothetical. You're on assignment at a client's location. One of the client's employees keeps hanging around you. The two of you don't work together. You don't know why does this person keep hanging around me. And this person says to you, I like it when you wear your hair loose, when you wear those tight sweaters. You feel uncomfortable. What do you do? This is not one of Employnet's employees. This is a client's employee. Do you A, report this to the Human Resources Director at Employnet or an Employnet representative? B, report this to your client's supervisor? C, handle the matter yourself? Or D, response A and or B. So report it to the HR Director at Employnet or an Employnet representative or to your client's supervisor. What do you think? And the answer is D, either response A and or B. Report the matter to the Employnet HR Director or an Employnet representative or your client supervisor. It doesn't matter that this individual is not an Employnet employee. This is somebody that you're encountering because of your job, and you should report this. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about unlawful harassment, concentrating in particular on sexual harassment. We'll also talk about discrimination and retaliation in the workplace. We're going to talk about bullying, which under California law is defined under a term called abusive conduct. We're going to talk about how you should conduct yourself when you're at work, what you should do if you're the victim of harassment or discrimination or retaliation or bullying, or if you witness this conduct. And we're also going to talk about what you should do if you have a disability that's making it difficult for you to do your work and you need a reasonable accommodation. And finally, we're going to talk about Employnet's policies. So I'm going to start with talking about Employnet's policies on harassment, discrimination, retaliation, and bullying. Now you will be receiving, or you may have already received from Employnet, a standalone policy on the prevention of harassment, discrimination, and retaliation in the workplace. I am not going to be reading that policy word for word. You should read that, and you should refer to that anytime that you feel that there is something that you have experienced or you've witnessed that you feel should be reported. So what is Employnet's commitment? Employnet is committed to providing a work environment for its employees, volunteers, independent contractors, unpaid interns, and applicants that is free of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. Employnet strictly prohibits discrimination and harassment of any kind, including harassment and discrimination based on what we call a protected category. These protected categories include sex, which includes pregnancy, perceived pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding or related medical conditions, race, color, religious creed, which includes religious dress and religious grooming, gender, gender identity and gender expression, and I'm going to talk about those in a lot more detail later on, age, which is 40 and over, mental disability, physical ability, legally protected medical condition, genetic information, national origin, ancestry, marital status, military or veteran status, sexual orientation, or any other characteristic protected under federal or state law or local ordinance. So we hear so much about sexual harassment, but under Employnet's policy, and as you'll see under the law, you are protected from harassment and discrimination based on being a member of any of those protected categories. Employnet's policy against harassment, discrimination, and retaliation applies to all persons involved in the operation of Employnet and prohibits unlawful discrimination, harassment, and retaliation by Employnet's employees, managers, supervisors, co-workers, independent contractors, interns, volunteers, and third parties. So we're talking about clients, employees of clients that are not employees of Employnet, customers, visitors to the location where you're working, suppliers, vendors, and others doing business with Employnet with whom you come into contact during the course of your work. So essentially anybody that you come into contact with because of your work at Employnet. Employnet also prohibits abusive and hostile conduct in the workplace, and that is conduct that is undertaken with malice that a reasonable person would find hostile, offensive, and unrelated to Employnet Inc.'s legitimate business interests. And I'm going to be talking in more detail about what exactly is abusive conduct a little later on. The policy also prohibits discrimination and harassment in the form of sexual favoritism. So that's essentially when somebody receives a benefit because somebody is sexually interested in them, finds them attractive, or somebody doesn't receive the benefit because they reject somebody who, for example, asks for a sexual advance, a sexual favor, and they say no, and they're denied some kind of benefit of employment. The policy also prohibits harassment and discrimination in the form of sex stereotyping. So that means when there's an assumption made about a person's appearance or behavior, or their ability or their inability to perform certain kinds of work based on some myth or some generalization about an individual's sex. So say, for example, we're not going to hire women in a position that involves traveling because women get pregnant and so they won't be able to travel. That would be a type of sex stereotyping. Or we're only going to hire men to do heavy-duty jobs because they're stronger. That would be a type of sex stereotype. This policy also prohibits discrimination and harassment against an individual who is transitioning, has transitioned, or is perceived to be transitioning. And I'm going to talk in more detail about this a little bit later on. This part of the policy is what I think is the most important part. how do you report if you feel you've been harassed or subjected to discrimination? So if you feel that you've been harassed, subjected to discrimination, retaliation by a supervisor, a coworker, a manager, a client supervisor, another client employee, some visitor to the premises where you're working, basically anybody that you come into contact because of your work for Employnet, then you have to immediately report the facts of the incident to the Employnet Human Resources Director or the client supervisor or an Employnet representative. And you can report to all of those individuals. You don't have to report to just one of them. And you've seen that in the various hypotheticals that I've presented to you. The report can be verbal or written. It should include details of the incident or the incidents, names of the individuals involved, names of any witnesses. So details are really important. So on what day did this happen? At what time? Was anybody else around? Where did this happen? If you're saying that somebody said something inappropriate, what did they say? What was their tone of voice? If it's a physical type of harassment, what happened? How were you touched? Where were you touched? If it's something visual, keeping copies, for example, if it's an inappropriate text message, being able to show that text message to one of the individuals that you report this to is really helpful. Any Employnet or client manager, supervisor, or employee who receives a complaint or report of harassment, discrimination, or retaliation must immediately report the complaint to the Human Resources Director or to the President of Employnet so that the complaint can be investigated in accordance with this policy. Now, Employnet will keep the complaint and the investigation confidential to the extent possible. But once you go to a supervisor and let the supervisor know that you feel that you're being harassed, the supervisor, as you can see in this policy, is required to report the incident. So if you want the supervisor to just keep that between the two of you, it's just a secret between the two of you, the supervisor cannot do that. But your complaint will be kept as confidential as possible. It won't be publicized to everybody. Only those people who need to know will be informed of your complaint. So what happens after you've made a complaint? Then there's an investigation. Employnet has a qualified individual timely conduct a fair, thorough, objective, and complete investigation of the complaint and gives everybody due process. So that means that you tell what happened to you, the individual that you feel harassed you tells their side, any witnesses tell what they saw, what they heard. At the conclusion of the investigation, Employnet will evaluate whether discrimination, harassment, or retaliation has occurred based on the evidence collected. And they'll look at the totality of the circumstances, the nature of the conduct, the context in which it happened, and look at what's the right thing to do, what's the right way to resolve this, does any corrective action need to take place. Employnet will as promptly as possible communicate its findings, including the remedial action, if any is taken, to the accused and to the complainant, and when appropriate to any other person who is directly concerned. And again, Employnet will keep the complaint and the investigation confidential to the extent possible. If it's determined that discrimination, harassment, or retaliation that violates Employnet's policy has occurred, then Employnet will take corrective or remedial action that makes sense given the severity of the offense. It can be a verbal discipline, it can be a written disciplinary action. If it's something really serious, really severe, it can be termination of employment. And then steps will be taken to ensure that there's no further discrimination, harassment, or retaliation. No individual will suffer any reprisals or retaliation for reporting harassment that happened to them or that they witnessed, or for participating in an investigation of a complaint. So Employnet encourages all employees, temporary associates, and internal employees to immediately report any incidents of discrimination, harassment, or retaliation forbidden by this policy so that complaints can be resolved promptly. I'm going to be giving specific examples of sexual harassment, explaining exactly what it is, but first I want to talk a little bit about the laws on sexual harassment. First, there's California law. The California agency that's responsible for matters involving harassment, discrimination, and retaliation is the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, known as the DFEH. The California law is the Fair Employment and Housing Act, known as FEHA. So if you Google either DFEH or FEHA, you'll see more information about that agency and about that law. There's also federal law. The federal agency that's responsible in this area is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, and the federal law that prohibits harassment, discrimination, and retaliation is called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If you Google EEOC, you will see more information about that agency and about the federal law. So what is unlawful sexual harassment? We've got a couple of photos here that are kind of stereotypical types of harassment. Unlawful sexual harassment is conduct that is uninvited, conduct that is unwelcome, that's directed at a person because of his or her sex. And sex includes pregnancy and medical conditions related to pregnancy. So we're talking unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, verbal conduct, visual conduct, physical conduct of a sexual nature, and we're looking at conduct that affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So it's something that it makes it difficult for you to do your job. You think, oh, I have to work with that person, but I'm so uncomfortable working with them. Or I don't even want to come into work because I'm going to have to face that individual. So a couple of things to keep in mind. The victim as well as the harasser can be a man or a woman. You can have men harassing women, women harassing men, men harassing men, women harassing women. The victim doesn't have to be a paid employee. It can be a volunteer. It can be an unpaid intern. The victim doesn't have to be the person who's being harassed. It can be individuals who are in the area, who are seeing the conduct, who feel uncomfortable because of it. And the victim can be somebody who's still currently working, or it can be somebody who has left their employment. The harasser can be a direct supervisor, a supervisor in another area, a co-worker, and as I mentioned in the hypotheticals at the beginning, a non-employee, a vendor, a client employee, a visitor to the area where you're working. A supervisor can be the victim of harassment, and you do not need to have sexual desire for conduct to be sexual harassment. So we usually think of sexual harassment being where one person is interested in the other sexually. But you can have individuals who are harassing somebody because of their sex, and there is no sexual desire involved. You can have women making fun of a female employee who's well endowed and saying, well, you're getting raises, you're getting promotions because of the way that you're built, and there's no sexual desire there, but that would be a form of sexual harassment. Now, harassment is unlawful when it is so severe or pervasive that it creates a hostile work environment or results in an unfavorable employment decision like a termination or a change in pay. Keep in mind, however, that's for you to be able to bring a legal claim. We don't want harassment to ever reach that level in the workplace, and Employnet's policies has a much lower threshold as far as when you can be disciplined for harassment. It doesn't have to reach the level of being severe or pervasive for you to be disciplined. So what do we mean by severe or pervasive? Did something just happen one time? Has it been happening continuously? Was it hard to avoid the conduct? You basically do this balancing. If it's really severe, it doesn't have to happen so many times, or it might not be so severe, but it's happening a lot. And just one incident can be enough. But as an example, say you go to work and somebody asks you out, you say no thanks, they never ask you out again. That's not severe, that's not pervasive, that's not harassment. But say you come into work and every day that person says, do you want to go out? 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 That's really annoying, right? That may not seem severe, but you've got the pervasive there because it continues to happen. Which of these is severe? A, telling a coworker, I like your sweater, I have one just like it. B, asking a coworker, where did you get your sweater? I'd like to get one like it from my brother. C, trying to pull off a coworker's sweater because you like it. D, saying to a coworker, I like your sweater, is it machine washable? What do you think? And the answer is C, trying to pull off a coworker's sweater because you like it. I mean, just imagine somebody says, I like your sweater, and then tries to pull it off of you. That would be severe conduct. How about these? Which of these is pervasive? A, you tell a coworker one time that you like his sweater. B, you tell a coworker every day, every time you see him, that you like his sweater. C, when a coworker wears a sweater you like, you tell him that you like it. D, all of the above. What do you think? And the correct answer is B, you tell a coworker every day, every time you see him, that you like his sweater. That is pervasive conduct. So here we have a scenario. You've got two employees. They tell jokes about sex. They make very detailed, uncomfortable comments about how their coworkers look in their work clothes. They give their coworkers nicknames like Hot Mama, Sexy, Sugar, Stud. And this conduct happens every day. A, the conduct described is harassment. B, the conduct is only harassment if it is by men against women. C, the conduct is not harassment if everyone laughs. D, the conduct is not harassment if it only bothers one employee. What do you think? So the answer is A, the conduct described is harassment. You've got severe conduct, you've got pervasive conduct. It doesn't matter if it's men or women engaging in the conduct, if it's same-sex or opposite-sex harassment. Doesn't matter if everybody laughs. Sometimes people laugh for a lot of reasons. Maybe it's a supervisor engaging in the conduct and they don't want to go against the supervisor. And it doesn't matter that only one person finds this offensive. If just one person finds it offensive, it's unwelcome to that individual and it's harassment. So is harassment the same as discrimination? Discrimination is where you have unfavorable treatment of an employee or an applicant based on a characteristic that's protected by the law. So you saw in your policy that long list that I read of national origin and race and sex. So treating somebody unfavorably based on one of those protected characteristics in a management decision. So for example, a performance evaluation, changing somebody's shift assignment, reducing wages, termination. So maybe changing somebody's shift to an earlier time because you think this person's a female and so I don't want them to have to walk to their car at night, but this means a change in benefits for the individual. That would be a form of discrimination. Compared with discrimination, harassment usually occurs due to personal motives that don't have anything to do with performance. So often it is because somebody is interested in somebody else, even though, as I mentioned, sexual desire is not required. But because of this personal motive, both employers and individuals can be held liable for unlawful harassment. So the actual individual who's engaging in the harassment can be sued. Now, as far as discrimination, because that involves management decisions, only employers can be held liable. So an example of discrimination would be, we're not going to promote Louise to manager because women are too emotional, versus harassment. I told Mike that he can work whatever shift he wants, but only if he goes out to dinner with me. There are two types of harassment. The first is quid pro quo, and that's essentially, if you do this for me, I'll do that for you. It's kind of the classic, I'll give you a raise if you'll go out on a date with me. An example is John, a supervisor, tells female employees that he won't give them their paychecks until they give him a kiss. That is classic quid pro quo harassment. Which of these is quid pro quo harassment? A. Mary, Enrique's supervisor, promises to give him a raise if he'll go out to dinner with her. B. Alan, a supervisor, jokes around telling employees that he'll make sure they get a raise if they go out with him. C. When Cynthia won't date Dale, a coworker, Dale withholds information from her that she needs to do her job. D. All of the above. What do you think? The answer is D, all of the above. So in the example of a supervisor who's joking, a supervisor shouldn't joke around that way. That is still quid pro quo harassment. And you can have quid pro quo harassment between a supervisor and an employee, or between co-workers, as you saw in the example of one employee withholding information from another because she wouldn't go out with him. Hostile work environment harassment. This is a type of harassment we've already been making some mention of. It's when there's unwelcome sexual conduct that unreasonably interferes with an employee's work performance and or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. Is this a hostile work environment, or is it hostile work environment harassment? John and Mary are co-workers. They play around flirting with each other. Both of them are married, but to somebody else, and they know they're just joking around. A. This is not hostile work environment harassment for John and Mary because the conduct is welcome between them. B. This could be hostile work environment harassment for other employees who witness the conduct and find it unwelcome. C. All of the above. What do you think? And the answer is C. All of the above. It's true the conduct is not unwelcome between them, so it's not a hostile work environment for the two of them, but others may be around who can feel uncomfortable, and it can create hostile work environment harassment for them. So John then changes his mind. Suddenly he feels uncomfortable with the flirting, and he tells Mary, let's stop, I don't like this anymore. And she doesn't. She thinks, well, we've been doing this, you've always thought it's funny. She continues doing it every day. A. This is not a hostile work environment for John if he started the flirtation in the first place. B. This is a hostile work environment for John regardless of who started the flirtation. C. None of the above. D. Both A and B. What do you think? And the answer is B. This is a hostile work environment for John regardless of who started the flirtation. And this is important because you can have a situation where conduct that is welcome becomes unwelcome. So if you have been joking around with a coworker a certain way, and then the employee initially is amused and engages in the conduct, but then says, you know what, I don't find this funny, let's stop, You have to respect that. Here we have another scenario. Larry asks out every employee. Whenever there's a new employee, he asks that person out. Everybody knows that's going to happen. So new employees are warned in advance, hey, Larry's going to ask you out. He does this with everybody. You can feel free to tell him no. Not a problem. A, Larry's conduct is not harassment because he treats everyone the same way. B, Larry's conduct is not harassment because employees have been warned about his conduct. C, Larry's conduct is harassment. D, none of the above. What do you think? The answer is C, Larry's conduct is harassment. It doesn't matter that he's doing this with everybody. It doesn't matter that everybody's been forewarned. This conduct is unwelcome and is harassment. So I mentioned at the beginning that I would be concentrating on discussions about sexual harassment, but California law prohibits harassment based on membership in several protected categories, as you saw in Employnet's policy. So what is a protected category? So the same protected categories that are in Employnet's policy are protected under California law. So employees are protected from harassment and discrimination based on being a member of any of these protected categories, and obviously we're all members of multiple protected categories. So here we have an example of conduct based on a different type of protected category. Martha goes to the movies, she sees Roger and Ben there, and after watching them for a little bit, she realizes they're a couple. She didn't know that. When she goes to work the next day, she sees them, she asks them about their relationship, why they don't like women, why they aren't interested in women. She asks them about their sexual relationship, and every time she sees them after this, she tells them that they should date her so that they can find out what they're missing. A, the conduct is okay. Martha's just being friendly. B, there's nothing wrong with the conduct. Roger and Ben can just say they don't want to date her. C, the conduct is harassment based on sexual orientation. D, none of the above. What do you think? The answer is C. This conduct is harassment based on sexual orientation. Another example. Geraldine speaks English very well, very easy to understand, but she has an accent. Every time she says something to the other employees, they say, "Que speak English." A, the conduct is harassment based on national origin. B, the conduct is okay if the employees don't understand Geraldine. C, making comments about an employee's accent is not harassment. D, none of the above. What do you think? And the answer is A, the conduct is harassment based on national origin, and accent is specifically protected under national origin. Now, who can bring a claim for harassment or discrimination? Obviously, if you're a member of a protected category, you can. But also if you're perceived to be a member of a protected category. So say you're perceived to be a national origin that you're not, and you're harassed based on that, you are protected. You're protected if you associate with somebody who's a member of a protected category and you're harassed. So if you are friends with a coworker and you are harassed because of that coworker's gender identity, for example, you are protected. Also, individuals who associate with somebody who is perceived to be a member of a protected category, those individuals are protected as well. Who else is protected? Volunteers, unpaid apprentices, independent contractors are all specifically protected under California law from harassment and discrimination. So I mentioned when I was talking about Employnet's policy that there are protections for individuals based on gender expression and gender identity and transitioning. So gender identity is each person's internal understanding of their gender, the gender that they identify with that may be different than the gender assigned to them at birth. Gender expression is that the individual wants to express themselves according to their gender identity. So effective July 1st of 2017, California law expanded its protections to protect individuals who are transitioning, have transitioned, or are perceived to be transitioning. And what do we mean by transitioning? It is very broad. It can be something as specific as having surgery to related to one's gender identity. It can be taking hormones, but it can also be that somebody wants to change the name that they use to be consistent with their gender identity, change the pronoun that's used, change the restroom that they use. All of these are types of transitioning. Under California law, employees have to be allowed to use the restroom facilities that correspond to the employee's gender identity or gender expression, regardless of the employee's assigned sex at birth. So if an employee says, I identify with being a gender that is different than the one assigned to me at birth, and I want to use the restroom consistent with that, the employer has to allow that. If the employer has a gender neutral restroom, the employer cannot require that the employee use that restroom. Employers have to also abide by an employee's request to be identified with a preferred gender, name, and or pronoun. So if an individual says, I want to go by a name that I feel is more consistent with my gender identity, or I want to change my pronoun to he or she or they, the employer has to abide by that. Employers can't oppose like a dress code, any kind of dress standards that are not consistent with the employee's gender identity or expression, unless there is a business necessity for that. An employer also cannot ask about or require documentation or proof of an employee's sex, gender, gender identity, or gender expression as a condition of employment. So if, for example, you want to use the restroom that's consistent with your gender identity, the employer can't ask you for documentation that proves your gender identity. Okay, so here we have an example. Nick applies for a job, interviews, and he presents as a male. He gets the job, he tells Human Resources that he's transitioning from female to male, and he asks if he can use the men's restroom. So the employer tells him that he'll need to have sex reassignment surgery before starting the job, and then once he starts working, he can use the men's room. What do you think? A, the conduct is discrimination based on gender identity because the employer had to allow Nick to use the restroom that corresponds with his gender identity. B, the conduct is discrimination based on gender identity because the employer delayed Nick's start date based on his gender identity. C, the conduct is discrimination based on gender identity because the employer required Nick to get sex reassignment surgery before he could start the job. D, all of the above. What do you think? The answer is D, all of the above. So not allowing him to use the restroom that corresponds with his gender identity was discrimination. Making him delay his start date based on his gender identity was discrimination, and requiring him to undergo sex reassignment surgery before he could start the job is discrimination based on gender identity. Another example, Daryl self-identifies as a female. He dresses in a skirt and heels, and he tells his employer he wants to be referred to as Carol and by feminine pronouns. The co-workers keep using the name Daryl, male pronouns, and they laugh when he walks by dressed as a woman. A, the conduct is harassment based on gender expression. B, the conduct is not harassment because the co-workers think Daryl looks funny in a skirt and heels. C, the coworkers can be disciplined under Employnet's policy for harassment. D, answers A and C. What do you think? And the answer is D. Responses A and C are correct. The conduct is harassment based on gender expression, and the coworkers can be disciplined under Employnet's policy for harassment. So, harassment comes in different forms: verbal, physical, visual. Verbal harassment, it can be derogatory comments, nicknames, sexual verbal abuse, comments about somebody's body that are unwelcome, about somebody's physical characteristics, profanity, asking somebody about their sexual practices. Here are some examples of verbal sexual harassment. Good morning, sweetheart. I'm exhausted. I spent a long, but I mean a long night with my girlfriend. Know what I mean? I can't wait for the office picnic. I'm already imagining you in a bathing suit. And now let's talk about physical harassment. Unwelcome touching. Hugging is a big one. Stalking, pinching, tickling, blocking somebody's movements, massaging somebody, standing too close to somebody, hovering over somebody. Lori is a serial hugger. She hugs coworkers to congratulate them, to console them, sometimes just to say hi. Lucy is not a hugger. She doesn't like to be touched. And Lori wants to convince her that hugging is great, so she hugs her even more. Lucy says, please stop, and Lori says, sorry, I'm just a hugger. I've got to hug everybody. So what do you think? The hugging is unwelcome to Lucy, and it is physical harassment. So one thing to keep in mind, we spend a lot of time at work. We make friends with people at work. Sometimes we're inclined to want to give somebody a hug to congratulate them, to console them. Always ask first. Not everybody is comfortable with being touched. Not everybody is comfortable with being hugged, with closeness. So if you want to give somebody a hug, just ask, is it okay if I give you a hug? Visual harassment can be somebody just staring at you, somebody making lewd or sexual gestures, inappropriate calendars, inappropriate screensavers, internet pornography. But more than anything nowadays, what we see as far as visual harassment are people using their smartphones to send inappropriate emails, texts, YouTube videos, you name it. Allie is Tom's supervisor. Tom tells her, hey, I used to be a tattoo artist. And she says, hey, I have a lot of tattoos. Next thing he knows, Tom starts receiving text messages from Allie with photos of her tattoos. The tattoos aren't offensive. They're like Hello Kitty or Snoopy or something like that. But it appears that they're on intimate parts of Allie's body. So this conduct is unwelcome to Tom, as you can see by the look on his face, and that is visual harassment. So we have a pop quiz. Which of these is verbal sexual harassment? A, you're glowing. Someone had sex last night. B, in those pants I can really tell that you've lost weight. C, I love it when you wear sandals. You have such sexy toes. D, all of the above. What do you think? And the answer is all of the above. So talking about somebody's sex life, that would be verbal harassment. Talking about somebody's appearance, that's indicating that you're paying too close attention to the way that their body looks, looking at parts of their body, that is verbal harassment. Which of these is physical sexual harassment? A, putting your arm around the shoulder of an employee sitting next to you. B, wiping food from a coworker's face. C, grabbing a coworker's behind because he grabbed yours. D, all of the above. What do you think? And the answer is D, all of the above. So, putting your arm around the shoulder of an employee sitting next to you, that's touching, that's just too close. Wiping food from a coworker's face, you can tell them, hey, you've got food on your face. You don't wipe it from their face. Grabbing a coworker's behind because he grabbed yours. If a coworker grabs your behind, you tell Employnet HR or an Employnet representative or a client supervisor, but you don't grab that person back. Which of these is visual sexual harassment? A, forwarding a YouTube video with sexual content to a coworker. B, showing coworkers an X-rated birthday card. C, sending a text to a coworker every day that says, "Good morning, sexy." D, all of the above. And the answer is D, all of the above. Obviously, anything that you send to another employee with sexual content or that you receive that has sexual content, that's inappropriate, that's harassment. If you receive an X-rated birthday card that you find funny, passing it around in the workplace is not the right thing to do. That's a violation of Employnet's policy. Sending texts every day saying "Good morning, sexy." Again, you've got the pervasive issue going on here, and I always, my best advice is use people's names. Don't give them some kind of a nickname, especially don't call them sexy. When and where is harassment prohibited? So we saw a little bit of this in our very first hypothetical. In some circumstances, offensive conduct that takes place outside of the workplace when employees are not working can be work-related sexual harassment. So here we have a group of employees. They go out dancing after work. Mary asks George, a coworker, to dance, and then she starts talking to him and she says, "I have been obsessed with you from the day you started working. I know that you love burritos, that you're a huge fan of the 49ers, that your dog's name is Spot. I know the street that you live on." And the truth is, they've almost never spoken to each other, so George feels pretty uncomfortable. What should George do? This is happening outside of work. Should he handle it on his own? Or B, report this to the HR director at Employnet or an Employnet representative or his client supervisor? What do you think? So the answer is B. Report this to the HR director at Employnet, an Employnet representative, or a client supervisor, or all of the above. It doesn't matter that this is happening outside of the workplace. This is a coworker that he'll be encountering when he returns to work. What about communications on Facebook, Twitter, things like that? So Jane and David work together. Jane friends David on Facebook, he accepts, and then she notices that he changes his profile picture, and now he's in a Speedo. He starts sending her messages on Facebook Messenger saying, "I changed the photo just for you," and sends her photos of himself partially clothed. What should Jane do? Should she report this to the HR director at Employnet or an Employnet representative or her client supervisor, including showing the photo and messages? Or B, should she handle the matter on her own? This is conduct happening outside of work on Facebook. What do you think? The answer is A. She should report this to the HR director at Employnet or an Employnet representative or her client supervisor, including showing the photo and the messages. It doesn't matter that this is happening on Facebook outside of work. Again, she's going to encounter this individual at work and feel uncomfortable. Retaliation. As I mentioned, Employnet's policy prohibits retaliation against individuals who have complained about harassment or who have participated in an investigation. So what is retaliation? Retaliation occurs when an employer takes an adverse action, so some kind of a negative action against an individual because he or she engaged in a protected activity. So what's a protected activity? That would be complaining about harassment, either because the individual believes that they were a victim or they saw some kind of harassment in the workplace, participating in an investigation of harassment. All of those are protected activities. Examples include denying somebody employment benefits, firing somebody, reducing their wages, changing their schedule, changing their position, some kind of a demotion, a bad performance evaluation, disciplinary action. All of those are examples of retaliation. Both the law and Employnet's policy prohibit an employer from retaliating against an employee for having reported or for having complained about any incident of discrimination, harassment, or retaliation, or for having participated in any investigation of incidents of discrimination, harassment, or retaliation. Earlier I mentioned that individuals can be held liable, personally liable for harassment. Specifically, California courts have held that individual employees, both supervisors and non-supervisors, can be liable for sexual harassment. So in California courts, an individual employee can be sued for sexual harassment or harassment based on membership in any protected category. Bullying. As I mentioned, Employnet's policy prohibits bullying, which under California law is called abusive conduct. So what is abusive conduct? For years, California has tried to pass laws making bullying unlawful and has not been successful. So instead, California defined this term called abusive conduct. And that's conduct of an employer or an employee in the workplace with malice that a reasonable person would find hostile, offensive, and unrelated to an employer's legitimate business interests. So what is malice? That's somebody's acting really to harm somebody. There's no justification. They want to damage somebody else. Abusive conduct can be verbal abuse, it can be insults, derogatory remarks, conduct that somebody would find threatening, intimidating, or humiliating, somebody trying to undermine somebody else's work performance. A single act is not abusive conduct unless it's really severe and egregious. So if you look at this, it really sounds very much like harassment, except you don't have the protected category. You don't have to be in a protected category to be a victim of abusive conduct, or the person doesn't have to be engaging in that conduct because of your membership in a protected category. Don't tolerate abusive conduct. If you're the victim of bullying, you should follow the same procedure that you follow if you feel you're a victim of harassment or discrimination. Report this to the Human Resources Director for Employnet, or an Employnet representative, or your client's supervisor. Which of the following are abusive conduct? A. Two co-workers are screaming at each other and one says, "You're a moron." B. Several employees gossip that an employee is sleeping with other employees. C. An employee arrives at work late and the boss says, "Are you so stupid that you don't know how to tell time?" D. All of the above. What do you think? The answer is D. All of the above. Co-workers screaming at one another, "You're a moron," is that's abusive, verbal abuse. Gossiping that an employee is sleeping with other employees is really trying to undermine an employee, trying to ruin their reputation, trying to damage them. And a supervisor calling an employee stupid, inferring that the person can't read a clock, is insulting, it's demeaning, and all of these would be abusive conduct. Now, one thing to keep in mind, abusive conduct is not a violation of the law. It is not a basis for bringing a legal claim. but Employnet's policy prohibits abusive conduct or bullying, so an employee can be disciplined and can be fired for engaging in abusive conduct. So now I also wanted to talk to you about reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities. So California law, as I mentioned, FEHA, and the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, known as the ADA, prohibit discrimination based on an employee's physical or mental disability or medical condition. Both California and federal law require an employer to reasonably accommodate individuals with disabilities to allow them to perform the essential functions of the job unless doing so would create an undue hardship for the employer. So what are Employnet's policies? If you look at the Equal Employment Opportunity Policy that Employnet has, to comply with applicable laws ensuring equal employment opportunities to qualified individuals with a disability, Employnet will make reasonable accommodations for the known physical or mental limitations of an otherwise qualified individual with a disability unless doing so would result in an undue hardship. So as you can see, in order to make the reasonable accommodation, Employnet has to know that there is this physical or mental limitation, and the individual has to be qualified to do their job. Any applicant or employee who requires an accommodation to be able to perform the essential functions of their job should contact the Employnet Human Resources Director and ask for an accommodation. The client, Employnet, and the applicant or the employee will engage in an interactive process to identify and evaluate possible accommodations. If an accommodation is identified that is reasonable and will not impose an undue hardship, Employnet and the client will make the accommodation. So we're going to be talking a little bit later about what is an interactive process, what is an undue hardship. But first, let's talk a little bit about California law. So under California law, an employer must provide a reasonable accommodation for qualified applicants and employees who, because of their disability, are unable to perform the essential functions of their job unless providing the accommodation would be an undue hardship to the employer, engage in a timely, good faith interactive process with applicants or employees in need of reasonable accommodation. Discrimination, harassment, and retaliation against employees with disabilities are prohibited, as you saw in the discussion about harassment and discrimination. So as you can see, Employnet's policy is consistent with California law. So what should you do if you have a disability and need a reasonable accommodation? Contact the Director of Human Resources at Employnet at 866-527-HIRE, H-I-R-E, or at 408-320-0676. Explain that because of a disability that you're having difficulty performing all of the functions of your job. Now, do not disclose details of your medical condition. That is private medical information. Employnet will not ask you for that, and you should not provide that. So then Employnet will engage in an interactive process with you. So this is one of those terms you saw in the policy and the law. What do we mean? Basically, it's communicating. Employnet and you will explore whether you need a reasonable accommodation for your disability to perform the essential functions of your job, and if so, how you can be reasonably accommodated. Employnet will ask you for a medical certification that sets forth any work restrictions, so not your medical condition, not your diagnosis, but what your work restrictions are. So employees have to cooperate with Employnet in the interactive process. So, communication going back and forth. So what is a reasonable accommodation? Well, it can be a lot of things. Adjustments to the area where you work, adjustments to your work schedule, relocating your work area, reassigning you to an available vacant position for which you're qualified and can perform the job duties with or without reasonable accommodations. Or a leave of absence, that's another type of reasonable accommodation. Now you can let Employnet know that you would like a particular accommodation, but Employnet is not required to provide you with the accommodation that you prefer. What is not a reasonable accommodation? Employers are not required to eliminate an essential job function of a position as an accommodation. They're not required to create a new position as an accommodation. They're not required to hire another employee to help the employee with a disability as an accommodation. And they're not required to displace or fire another employee as a reasonable accommodation for an employee with a disability. As you saw in the policy and in the law, an employer is not required to provide a reasonable accommodation if it would cause undue hardship to the employer. So for an example, an employer is not required to provide an accommodation that's too expensive or that would have a major impact on the other employees. So here's an example. Layla has chronic back problems, and over the weekend her back starts acting up. In her job, she's required to lift up to 20 pounds. She goes to work on Monday and she finds she can't lift 20 pounds. So she calls the Director of Human Resources and she explains her situation. The Director of Human Resources asks her to get medical certification from her doctor of any work restrictions, but not about her specific medical condition. Layla goes to her doctor and gets a note that says she must not lift more than 5 pounds for a 2-month period. The employer then looks at Layla's position to try and figure out whether lifting is an essential duty. It finds that she is regularly required to lift up to 20 pounds on a daily basis. The employer then looks at whether it can provide her with a reasonable accommodation so that she does not have to lift more than 5 pounds for a 2-month period. Layla suggests that the employer hires someone else for the 2-month period to handle the lifting duties. Is that a reasonable accommodation? No, so that would not be a reasonable accommodation. An employer is not required to hire somebody else to help the employee with a disability as an accommodation. What would some reasonable accommodations be? For example, placing Layla in another position that is open, that's available, for which she is qualified, that does not involve lifting more than 5 pounds. Adjusting her duties so that she does not have to lift more than 5 pounds for a 2-month period. Placing Layla on a leave of absence for the 2-month period. Now these are just some of the possible reasonable accommodations. Employnet evaluates each request for an accommodation based on the specific facts. So looking at the work restrictions, looking at the essential functions of the position, looking at the current situation, what positions are available, etc. So here we have a final exam. This is a true or false exam. 1. You should only report conduct to Employnet that you know for sure is unlawful harassment. False. If you feel that conduct is unwelcome, if you feel that it violates Employnet's policy, you should report it to the Employnet Director of Human Resources, an Employnet representative, or you can also report it to a client supervisor. You do not have to know for sure that it's unlawful harassment. 2. You should report to Employnet any harassing conduct by a supervisor or coworker. True. If you feel that a supervisor or a coworker is harassing you, you need to report that so that something can be done to address the situation, so that there can be an investigation, and if disciplinary action needs to be taken, then that can be looked into. 3. Unlawful harassment is limited to sexual harassment. False. You saw the long list of protected categories under Employnet's policy and under California law that includes race, color, national origin, gender identity and expression, mental and physical disability, a long, long list. So unlawful harassment is not limited to sexual harassment. 4. To be illegal, harassment must be severe or pervasive. True. If somebody's going to bring a successful legal claim, then the harassment has to be severe or pervasive to win that claim. 5. Harassment does not have to be severe or pervasive to violate Employnet's policy. True. So in order to be subject to discipline, harassment doesn't have to reach that level of severe or pervasive. Employnet has a zero tolerance policy for harassment. 6. The law prohibits retaliation against employees who report allegations of harassment. True. So both the law and Employnet's policy prohibit retaliation against somebody who report harassment or are involved in an investigation. 7. Employnet must protect you if a third party, like a client's employee or a vendor, harasses you. True. Employees are protected from harassment by essentially anybody that you come into contact with, so not just coworkers and supervisors, but third parties as well. 8. If you ask, your harassment complaint can be kept between you and the supervisor to whom you reported the harassment. False. So if you tell a supervisor about harassment, the supervisor has to report that so that an investigation can take place and the matter can be addressed. The supervisor cannot just keep it between the two of you, but will keep it as confidential as possible. 9. Although bullying, abusive conduct, is not illegal, Employnet prohibits it in the workplace. True. Yes, so abusive conduct is not a basis for a legal claim, but it is a basis for being disciplined under Employnet's policy. Number 10. An employer must allow an employee to use the restroom that corresponds with the employee's gender identity. True. So as I mentioned, even if an employer has a men's room, a ladies' room, and a neutral restroom, if the employee wants to use a restroom that corresponds with their gender identity, the employer has to allow that without asking for any documentation about the employee's gender identity. Number 11. An employee can be individually liable for sexual harassment. True. So whether an employee is a supervisor or a coworker, that person can be individually sued for sexual harassment. Number 12. If you have a disability and need an accommodation to do your job, you should contact Employnet's Director of Human Resources. And that is true. We went over the policy that Employnet has, and that is who you should contact. Number 13. Once you request an accommodation, Employnet and you must engage in an interactive process. True. So both according to Employnet's policy and according to California law, that is what will happen once you make that request for an accommodation. Number 14. Employnet must grant you the reasonable accommodation that you prefer. False. So although you can say, I would prefer to have this particular accommodation, Employnet is not required to give you that accommodation that you prefer. If there's another reasonable accommodation that works and works better for Employnet, it can provide you with that one instead of your preference. Number 15. Employnet is not required to create a new position for an individual with a disability who needs an accommodation. And that is true. The law does not require an employer to create a whole new position for someone as an accommodation. And here you can see the answers in red. Hopefully you didn't look ahead. So good job, everybody. I'm assuming everybody got an A+, got all of the answers right. So one more thing. If you have any questions, please feel free to call or email Employnet's Director of Human Resources at 866-527-HIRE or 408-320-0676, or send an email to the email address shown, or you can call me, Sherilyn Payne, at 831-373-1241, or send me an email. So thank you so much. I hope this training has been helpful to you, and have a great day.